a quiet archive record. Tonight, we step into the stillness between moments, where thoughts dim and the mind begins to wander. Over the last 100 years, modern science has explained an enormous amount. But it has also made confident claims that later turned out to be wrong, incomplete, or badly overstated. Some errors were honest mistakes caused by limited tools. Some came from weak studies, small samples, and wishful thinking. Others spread because the ideas were exciting, simple to repeat, or useful to institutions. In this episode, we focus on the biggest and most famous cases where mainstream scientific thinking either got the core claim wrong or pushed a story that later had to be corrected. We start with the biggest mistakes first, then move through medicine, nutrition, psychology, technology, space, and the way research itself can mislead. Tonight, we go through everything science got wrong in the last 100 years. If you ask most people what science is, they will say it is a set of facts. In reality, science is a method for reducing guesswork. It is a system for testing ideas, comparing them to the world, and updating our beliefs when the evidence changes. That sounds clean, but in real life, the method runs through human beings, and human beings have limits. Scientists work with incomplete data. They work with tools that are always improving. They work with funding pressures, publishing incentives, and social status. They work inside cultures that reward clear stories more than messy uncertainty. They also work inside bodies and brains that can fool them, just like anyone else. That does not mean science is useless. It means science is powerful but imperfect, and it moves by correction. Some corrections are minor. Others are painful, public, and slow. This story is about those painful corrections. Not to mock science, but to understand how wrong ideas can become popular, how they can last, and what it takes to finally move past them. We will start with the biggest category of mistakes, because it touches almost every field and every decade. For much of the last century, people treated a published study as if it was a stamp of truth. But one of the most important lessons of modern research is that many studies do not replicate. That means another team repeats the same test with similar methods and does not get the same result. This is not a rare problem. In some areas, it has been a crisis. If you read headlines from the last decades, you have seen the pattern. A study says coffee is bad, then coffee is good. A study says eggs are bad, then eggs are fine. A study says a vitamin prevents disease, then the benefit disappears when larger trials are done. People sometimes joke that scientists cannot make up their minds, but the deeper issue is that many early findings were too fragile. They were signals pulled out of noise. A typical path looks like this. A small study finds an effect. The effect is exciting. The study is published. News reports it as a breakthrough. Many people accept it as real. Then later, larger studies fail to find it, or find it is much smaller, or only exists in a narrow context. Why does this happen so often? One reason is sample size. If you study 20 people, random variation can look like a strong result. Another reason is bias, often unintentional. Researchers can make choices about which data to include, which outcomes to focus on, and which statistical tests to run. When you have many choices, you can keep trying different paths until something looks significant. This is sometimes called p-hacking. It does not always involve dishonesty. It can be the natural result of exploring data without strict rules set in advance. Another reason is publication bias. Journals prefer positive results because they are more interesting. A study that finds no effect is harder to publish. So the published literature can become a pile of positive claims, even if many negative results exist in drawers. Over time, this creates a distorted picture. It makes effects seem more real and more reliable than they are. This is a mistake that science itself has had to face. In recent years, there has been a push for pre-registration, for sharing data, for better statistics, and for replication studies. But the damage of the earlier era is still with us. Whole lines of research were built on shaky ground. Treatments were promoted too early. Policies were shaped by weak evidence. People lost trust when the claims fell apart. Now we move to some of the most dramatic single mistakes, the ones that did the most harm. One of the most infamous scientific disasters of the last 100 years is the story of lobotomies. In the mid-20th century, doctors performed a surgery that cut connections in the brain, often in the frontal lobes. The idea was that severe mental illness could be relieved by changing brain circuits. At the time, psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded. Many patients suffered for years with little help. Families were desperate. Doctors were desperate too. Then a procedure appears, and some patients seem calmer after. The results were promoted as a breakthrough. The inventor won a Nobel Prize. The surgery spread, but the cost was enormous. Many patients were left with severe personality changes, loss of initiative, emotional flattening, and cognitive damage. Some became unable to live independently. Some died from complications. How did something so brutal become accepted? Part of the answer is that there were few alternatives. Part is that early reports focused on the most favorable cases. Part is that the definition of success was vague. If a patient became less disruptive, that could be labeled an improvement, even if the person lost their inner life. Over time, better medications arrived, and the practice fell out of favor. Today, lobotomies are a warning sign of what happens when a medical field moves too fast and measures the wrong outcomes. The biggest mistake here was not just a single surgery. It was the confidence. It was the readiness to treat irreversible brain damage as acceptable, based on thin evidence and social pressure. Another major medical failure of the last century was the misuse of thalidomide. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, thalidomide was marketed in some countries as a treatment for morning sickness and as a sedative. It was seen as safe, but it caused severe birth defects when taken during pregnancy. Thousands of children were born with shortened limbs and other major problems. This disaster helped reshape drug regulation. It pushed governments to demand stronger evidence of safety, especially for pregnant people. It also showed how testing can miss rare but catastrophic outcomes, and how marketing can outrun caution. Now we step into a mistake that touched millions, not through a single drug, but through a long public story about health. For decades, mainstream nutrition advice treated fat as a primary villain. The message became simple. Fat makes you fat. Fat clogs arteries. Low fat is healthy. There is some truth in the idea that certain fats matter for heart disease, but the public message went far beyond what the evidence could support. In many places, low-fat guidance led people to eat more refined carbohydrates and added sugar. Food companies created low-fat products that were high in sugar and starch because removing fat removes taste. At the same time, the role of sugar in metabolic disease was often downplayed. In some cases, industry influence helped shape the conversation. Over the years, the science became more complex. Different fats have different effects. Overall dietary patterns matter. Ultra-processed food matters. Total calories matter. The simple story was not accurate. The mistake was not that scientists studied fat. The mistake was turning a complex field into a single enemy, then building policy and marketing around it. A related mistake was the confidence in certain vitamins and supplements as disease prevention. In the late 20th century, it seemed plausible that antioxidant supplements like beta-carotene and vitamin E might reduce cancer and heart disease. Observational studies showed that people who ate more fruits and vegetables had better health, so some assumed that the key was antioxidants. Large randomized trials tested supplements. Some found no benefit, some found harm. In certain groups, beta-carotene increased lung cancer risk. The mistake here was confusing association with causation. People who eat more fruits and vegetables may differ in many ways. They may smoke less. They may exercise more. They may have better access to healthcare. The foods may matter, but the isolated chemical in pill form is not the same thing. Now we move into a mistake that was smaller in scale, but huge in cultural impact. For years, many people believed that humans use only 10% of their brain. This claim is false. Brain imaging, lesion studies, and basic neuroscience show that we use essentially all parts of the brain across a normal day. Different networks activate for different tasks. Even at rest, the brain is active. So how did the myth spread? It is a perfect example of an appealing story. It suggests hidden potential. It makes people feel that they have a secret reservoir of power. The claim also fit well with self-help marketing. It was repeated in books, movies, and speeches. Once it became common, it gained the feeling of truth. This is not a major scientific harm, like a bad surgery, but it shows how a wrong idea can persist even when experts disagree with it, because it is memorable. Now we step into psychology, a field that has faced its own replication crisis. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, psychology produced many famous findings about human behavior. Some were solid, others were not. One example is the idea that power posing can quickly change hormones and transform confidence. The story went viral. People tried it before job interviews, but later studies failed to replicate the hormone effects, and the claimed benefits shrank. Another example is the strength of priming effects, where subtle cues supposedly change behavior in dramatic ways. Some early priming studies were exciting, but many later failed to replicate. A deeper issue is that human behavior is noisy. Context matters, culture matters, measurement matters. If you test a small group in a lab, you may find a result that does not hold up in the real world. This does not mean psychology is fake. It means the field had to learn, again, the need for stronger methods, larger samples, and more honest reporting. Now we move to medicine again, to a mistake that became one of the most damaging medical frauds of the last 100 years. In 1998, a paper was published claiming a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. The claim was wrong. The study was deeply flawed. It involved a tiny sample. It had serious conflicts of interest. Later investigations found misconduct. The paper was retracted, but the damage was already done. The story spread widely. Some people lost trust in vaccines. Vaccination rates dropped in some areas. Outbreaks of measles and other diseases followed. This is a case where the scientific system eventually corrected itself, but the public correction did not move as fast as the misinformation. The mistake here involved more than one paper. It involved media amplification, weak skepticism by some journalists, and the human tendency to remember scary stories. Now we step into another field with a long history of overconfidence, and that is space science and astronomy. In the early 20th century, there was a debate about what the spiral nebulae were. Some thought they were gas clouds within the Milky Way. Others argued they were distant galaxies. This was resolved by better observation. It is a reminder that big questions can be limited by tools. But in the last 100 years, we have also seen repeated waves of overhyped claims, like certain signs of life on Mars. In 1996, a meteorite from Mars, called ALH 4001, was presented as possible evidence of ancient microbial life. Some scientists pointed to structures that looked like fossils and chemicals that seemed biological. The idea was exciting. Headlines suggested life on Mars. Later analysis showed that the features could be explained by non-biological processes. The claim was not settled as life. It became a lesson in how strong the desire for a result can be, and how cautious one must be with ambiguous data. Now we shift to physics, where the stakes are different. Physics has been remarkably successful, but even here there have been famous errors. One is the case of cold fusion. In 1989, two chemists announced that they had achieved nuclear fusion at room temperature using a simple tabletop setup. If true, it would have changed energy forever. But other labs could not reproduce the results. The claim collapsed. This case showed how a dramatic announcement can outrun verification, and how the pressure for fame and funding can distort judgment. Another famous physics error was the claim of faster-than-light neutrinos. In 2011, a team reported that neutrinos sent from CERN to Italy arrived slightly earlier than expected, suggesting they traveled faster than light. It was a shocking claim. If true, it would have challenged a core part of modern physics. The team did something responsible. They invited scrutiny. Later, the issue was traced to equipment problems, including a loose cable and timing errors. The result vanished. This case is actually a good sign because it shows a system that can correct itself. But it is still a reminder that measurements can be wrong, even by experts. Now we go to a mistake that lasted for decades in a more subtle way. It is the belief that ulcers are mainly caused by stress and spicy food. For a long time, stomach ulcers were blamed on lifestyle. People were told to reduce stress and avoid certain foods. Then two researchers, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, argued that a bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, was the real cause for many ulcers. At first, the idea was dismissed. The stomach was thought to be too acidic for bacteria to survive. Marshall famously drank a culture of the bacterium and developed gastritis, helping prove the point. Over time, the evidence became overwhelming. Antibiotics could cure many ulcers. The earlier belief was not evil, but it was wrong. It shows how a field can become locked into an assumption, and how hard it can be for a new idea to break through. Next, we step into a category that may be one of the biggest errors in medical history, and that is the overuse of certain treatments before strong trials. One example is hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women. For years, HRT was widely prescribed, with the belief that it would reduce heart disease risk and improve long-term health. Some observational studies supported the idea. Then large randomized trials, including the Women's Health Initiative, found increased risks for certain outcomes, including blood clots and some cancers, depending on the regimen. The story became more nuanced later, with timing and patient selection mattering. But the earlier confidence was too high. The mistake here was trusting observational data too much and underestimating how selection bias can make a treatment look better than it is. Now we move to another big category, and that is the mistaken belief that more technology always means better outcomes. In medicine, new devices and tests can be powerful, but they can also lead to overdiagnosis. If you look harder, you will find more tiny abnormalities. Some of them would never cause harm, but once detected, they can lead to anxiety, biopsies, surgery, and side effects. Certain cancer screenings have faced this issue. Some thyroid cancers, for example, increased in diagnosis without a matching increase in deaths, suggesting many were overdiagnosed. The mistake is thinking that finding something is always good. Sometimes it only creates harm. Now we step into a more social scientific era, one tied to bias and bad assumptions. In the early and mid-20th century, eugenics was promoted in some academic circles as a way to improve society by controlling reproduction. It was presented as scientific. It used statistics and heredity language, but it was deeply tied to racism, class prejudice, and authoritarian policy. It led to forced sterilizations and cruel social programs. The mistake here was not a simple measurement error. It was a misuse of science to justify existing power and prejudice. This is one of the darkest reminders that science can be used as a tool and that data can be wrapped around moral choices. Now we move into another area where science was used to support a wrong story, sometimes with government backing. Consider the history of leaded gasoline. For decades, lead was added to gasoline to improve engine performance. Companies promoted it as safe, but lead is a neurotoxin. It harms brain development, especially in children. It lowers IQ. It increases behavioral problems. The harm was massive and spread across populations. Scientists like Claire Patterson fought against the industry and helped reveal the scale of lead contamination. The mistake here involved industry influence, slow regulation, and the difficulty of proving harm in large populations. But the evidence was there, and the delay cost a great deal. Now we step to another famous case where medicine got something wrong for too long, and that is stomach acid suppression without enough attention to long-term effects. Drugs like proton pump inhibitors can be very helpful, but they are also widely used for long periods, sometimes without clear need. Over time, research suggested possible links to nutrient absorption issues, infections, and other risks, especially with long use. The bigger point is not that these drugs are always bad. It is that common use can spread faster than careful long-term study. Now we turn to a psychological idea that was widely popularized, and that is the belief in simple learning styles. For years, many educators were told that students learn best if teaching matches their learning style, like visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. It sounds reasonable, but research has not supported the strong claim that matching style improves outcomes in the way people think. People may have preferences, but the best method depends on the material. The mistake here is turning a loose idea into a strict educational rule without strong evidence. Now we step into a newer era mistake tied to big data and artificial intelligence. There has been a belief that if you collect enough data, the truth will reveal itself, and you do not need careful theory. But data can reflect bias. Data can be incomplete. Algorithms can learn patterns that do not generalize. In medicine, some AI systems seemed accurate in trials, but later failed in real hospitals because the data sources were different. In policing, some predictive tools reinforced existing bias. The mistake is thinking that a pattern in data automatically equals a real causal truth. Now, we should also talk about how science sometimes gets wrong, not the final answer, but the timeline. A field can know that something is likely harmful, but still fail to act. Tobacco is an example. By the mid-20th century, evidence linking smoking to lung cancer was strong, yet doubt was manufactured by industry. The public debate was prolonged. The scientific mistake was not mainly about data. It was about communication, policy, and the vulnerability of science to organized campaigns. Now we move to another big mistake in public health messaging. For years, some authorities treated drug addiction mainly as a moral failure, rather than a medical and social problem. This view shaped policy. It shaped prisons. It shaped stigma. Over time, neuroscience and social research supported a more complex view of addiction, involving reward circuits, trauma, environment, and genetics. The older view did not disappear, but it was incomplete, and it led to harmful responses. Now we step back and ask a bigger question. Why do these mistakes happen? A common pattern is that early evidence is treated as final. Another pattern is that a simple story is easier to spread than a complex one. A third pattern is that incentives matter. Researchers want to publish. Journals want novelty. Media wants headlines. Companies want profit. Governments want policies that sound decisive. A fourth pattern is that humans are not built for uncertainty. We like clean answers. We like winners and losers. But reality is often mixed. The best version of science is not a list of correct beliefs. It is a culture that admits uncertainty, tests hard, and updates fast. When science fails, it often fails because it becomes too sure of itself, too tied to status, or too slow to admit error. Over the next century, the hope is not that science stops being wrong. The hope is that it becomes wrong in smaller ways, for shorter times, and with less harm. And for the rest of us, the lesson is not to reject science. The lesson is to treat it like a living process. When you see a new claim, ask, how large was the study? Was it replicated? Was it observational or randomized? Who funded it? How big is the effect? And what would it take for the claim to be proven wrong? Because the difference between science and non-science is not that science is never wrong. It is that science, at its best, is willing to be wrong in public and then change. There is also a quieter lesson hidden under the replication problem. Many discoveries are real, but the first report often exaggerates the size. If a treatment truly helps a little, the early studies might make it look like it helps a lot. This can happen because the early samples are small, and because the first researchers to publish are often the most optimistic. Then, once the idea is famous, later studies bring the estimate down. The effect shrinks. The claim becomes less dramatic. The world sees that as a failure, but in many cases, it is not a failure. It is what measurement looks like when it becomes more careful. A useful phrase here is regression to the mean. Early results can be extreme by chance. Later results move closer to the average. This pattern is one reason you should be suspicious of anything described as a miracle. Now we can move through a set of large, well-known cases where the story shifted in public and where the correction mattered. Consider cholesterol and dietary cholesterol. For decades, many people were told to avoid foods like eggs because they contain cholesterol. The idea was simple. Eat cholesterol, raise blood cholesterol, cause heart disease. There is a link between blood cholesterol and heart risk in certain contexts. But dietary cholesterol does not translate in a simple way for most people. The body adjusts. It makes its own cholesterol. It changes absorption. Over time, the strict fear of eggs weakened. Guidelines became more flexible. This does not mean diet does not matter. It means the story was simplified, and the public took the simplified version as a law. Another case is salt. High blood pressure is a major health risk. Salt can raise blood pressure in many people, but salt sensitivity differs. The effect depends on the rest of the diet, potassium intake, overall calories, and genetics. Public messaging often made it sound like one number fits everyone. That is easy to communicate, but it does not capture reality. The mistake is not saying salt matters. The mistake is pretending the answer is the same for every person and that the trade-offs are simple. Now consider the idea that a single nutrient explains obesity. At different times, fat was blamed, then sugar, then carbohydrates in general, then seed oils, then eating late at night. Each of these ideas can contain some truth in some context. But obesity is a system problem. It is shaped by calorie density, food processing, marketing, stress, sleep, poverty, walkable cities, medication, and many other factors. When science speaks in headlines, it often turns a system problem into a single villain. That is a mistake that repeats. Now we move into a major medical shift that is often described as science being wrong, even though it is more accurate to say the old model was incomplete. For years, many doctors believed peptic ulcers were mainly caused by stress and lifestyle. It was not a crazy belief. Stress can affect the gut. Some drugs can damage the stomach lining, but for many ulcers, the main driver was an infection. Once Helicobacter pylori was accepted, ulcer treatment changed. Antibiotics became a key tool. This shift teaches two things. First, the cause of a disease can be hidden, even when it is close to the surface. Second, a medical culture can become comfortable with a story and keep repeating it. Now we can talk about a related issue, and that is how long it can take for good evidence to change routine practice. In medicine, there is a gap between what research shows and what many clinics do. Sometimes the gap is caused by uncertainty. Sometimes it is habit. Sometimes it is training. Sometimes it is money. This creates a space where outdated beliefs can last for years. A classic example is the treatment of back pain. For a long time, many patients were told strict bed rest was best. Later evidence suggested that, for many common back pain cases, staying active within reason is better than long bed rest. The correction did not happen overnight. Now we move into an area where science made mistakes not only in facts, but in ethics. In the 20th century, researchers ran studies that harmed people, especially people with less power. One of the most infamous is the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States. For decades, black men with syphilis were observed without being properly treated, even after penicillin became available. The study was not just a moral failure, it also damaged trust in medicine for generations. It is sometimes described as science being wrong, but the deeper truth is that science can be used without respect for human beings. This is not a mistake that gets fixed by better math. It gets fixed by ethics, oversight, and accountability. Now we step into another kind of mistake, where a plausible story becomes a cultural script. In the late 20th century, there was a wave of belief in recovered memories. Some therapists and patients came to believe that traumatic memories could be completely blocked for years and then recovered in therapy, often with vivid detail. There are real cases where people remember things later. Memory can change over time. Trauma can affect recall. But the strong claim that therapy could reliably uncover hidden memories and that these memories were likely accurate was not supported in the way the public assumed. In some cases, suggestive techniques may have created false memories. The consequences were serious. Families broke apart. People were accused. Courts were involved. This story shows how a field can take a real insight that memory is complex and turn it into a confident practice that goes beyond the evidence. Now, we can talk about a famous social psychology story that many people learn in school. The Stanford prison experiment became a symbol of how quickly ordinary people become cruel in certain roles. The story is powerful, but later scrutiny raised questions about the methods, the role of coaching, and the way the situation was created. The experiment still has value as a warning about power and institutions, but as a clean scientific proof, it is weaker than the legend suggests. This is another pattern. A dramatic story becomes bigger than the data. Now we move into one of the most damaging mistakes in modern pain medicine. In the late 20th and early 21st century, some medical systems treated opioid painkillers as safer for long-term use than they really were. There were claims that addiction risk was low when opioids were prescribed for pain. There was strong marketing. There was pressure to treat pain as a vital sign. Opioids can be necessary in certain situations. They can be life-saving in acute pain and in palliative care. But widespread long-term prescribing contributed to addiction and overdose crises in many places. This was not caused by one study. It was a network of weak evidence, incentives, and messaging. It is a case where medicine believed a comforting story. Now we step into another medical shift that is often misunderstood. For decades, antibiotics were treated as a simple win. If you had an infection, take antibiotics. If you might have an infection, take them to be safe. The problem is that antibiotics also create selection pressure. They kill susceptible bacteria and leave resistant ones. Overuse helps create antibiotic resistance. It also harms the microbiome and can cause side effects. Science did not exactly get antibiotics wrong. It got the long-term ecology wrong. It underestimated the speed and scale of resistance. Now we move into an environmental example. In the mid-20th century, many chemicals were used widely before their long-term impact was clear. DDT is a common example. It was effective against insects and helped reduce malaria in some contexts. But it also accumulated in the environment and harmed wildlife, including birds. The correction was not simply banning a chemical. It was learning that a tool can have hidden costs across systems. This is a repeating theme in science and technology. a new tool solves one problem and creates another. Now we go back to the question of what counts as the biggest mistake. If you measure by suffering, lobotomies, thalidomide, lead, and the opioid crisis are near the top. If you measure by how widely the wrong story spread, the vaccine and autism claim is near the top. If you measure by how much confusion it created, nutrition headlines are near the top. But there is also a large mistake that is quieter, and it is about how certainty is communicated. Many scientific claims are probabilistic. They come with error bars. They come with assumptions. When those claims are translated into public messaging, the uncertainty often disappears. A risk ratio becomes a yes or no statement. A weak correlation becomes a cause. A model becomes a prophecy. Then, when the claim changes, the public feels betrayed. This is not only a media problem. Scientists sometimes contribute to it because they want attention and funding. Now, we can take a tour through a few more examples where the correction is worth understanding. Consider stomach acid and digestion. For years, people assumed that heartburn always meant too much acid, and that long-term acid suppression was a simple fix. Acid suppression can be important for certain cases. It can prevent ulcers and protect the esophagus. But wide, long-term use grew faster than long-term data. Later research suggested that long-term suppression may be linked to certain risks in some people, including infections and nutrient issues. The larger lesson is that long-term exposure matters. A drug that looks safe for weeks can have different effects over years. Now consider the belief that more screening is always better. Screening can save lives, but it can also find tiny cancers that would never grow. When that happens, people can be treated for diseases that would never hurt them. They may get surgery, radiation, or drugs they did not need. This is called overdiagnosis. The mistake here is confusing detection with benefit. The best screening programs balance benefits and harms, and they change as evidence improves. Now we can talk about a mistake in neuroscience that has shaped many popular books. People often imagine the brain as a set of separate modules, each with a single job, like a part for anger, a part for love, a part for logic. The reality is that many functions are distributed networks. The same areas are used for multiple tasks. The brain is not a clean map with labeled neighborhoods. The mistake is not that localization exists. It does. The mistake is turning a complex network into a cartoon. Now we step into an example from early computing and AI. In the mid-20th century, there were waves of optimism about artificial intelligence. Researchers predicted that human-level AI was close. Then the limits became clear. The computing power was not enough. The data was not enough. The problems were harder than expected. This led to periods called AI winters, where funding and interest dropped. The mistake was not trying. It was being too confident about timelines. Now we return to physics for another famous case. In the early 20th century, some astronomers believed they could see canals on Mars, suggesting engineering by intelligent beings. Better telescopes and later spacecraft showed that the canals were illusions shaped by the brain trying to connect faint patterns. This is a reminder that observation is not neutral. Your brain completes the picture. Now we can talk about another place where the brain completes a picture, and that is in eyewitness testimony. For a long time, many courts treated eyewitness memory as strong evidence. Research in psychology showed that memory is reconstructive. It can be influenced by questions, stress, and time. People can be confident and still wrong. This has led to changes in police lineups and interrogation methods in some places. The mistake was assuming memory works like a recording. Now we step into another famous false certainty. For years, many people believed that humans have a clear set of 5 senses. In reality, we have more. We have proprioception, the sense of body position. We have balance. We have internal signals from organs. This is not a major harm, but it shows how a simplified story can become a basic fact in the public mind. Now we should talk about the role of money and industry. Science is expensive. Many studies are funded by companies. This does not automatically mean fraud, but it can shape what questions get asked, what outcomes get measured, and how results are framed. In nutrition science, industry funding has been linked to biased outcomes in some reviews. In pharmaceutical research, selective reporting has been a real issue in the past. This is why transparency matters. Now we can move to another large public health story, where science and policy tangled. For a long time, some health authorities underestimated how much air pollution harms health. Air pollution affects lungs, heart, and brain. It increases risk of asthma, heart attacks, and early death. The evidence grew over time, with better sensors and better population studies. Regulation improved in some places, but the story also shows how hard it is to act on slow, widespread harm. Now we come to one of the most important corrections in the last 100 years. And it is not a single mistake. It is the correction of who gets included in research. For much of the 20th century, many medical studies focused on men. Women were excluded from trials, sometimes out of fear of pregnancy risk, sometimes out of convenience. But that meant drug dosing, side effects, and symptoms were less understood for half the population. For example, heart attack symptoms in women were less recognized because the classic symptom profile was built from male patients. This is a case where science got the sampling wrong, and when sampling is wrong, the conclusions can fail in real life. Now we can talk about a famous medical claim that was pushed too hard. In the past, some doctors promoted routine tonsillectomies for children as if they were a general health benefit. Over time, the practice became more selective because the risks and benefits were clearer. The lesson is that surgery can be overused when it becomes a standard habit. Now we can talk about one of the oldest temptations in science, and that is the temptation to tell a simple story about complex behavior. In the early 20th century, some people believed intelligence could be measured as a single number that captured human worth. IQ testing can measure certain cognitive skills, but the way it was used often went beyond measurement. It was used to justify class and race hierarchies, immigration policy, and schooling systems. The mistake was treating a test score as destiny and treating complex human ability as one fixed trait. Modern research is more careful, but the cultural shadow remains. Now we can return to the central question. How should you think about science? Knowing all this, a useful approach is to separate the method from the headlines. The method says, show your work, share your data, let others test it, admit uncertainty, update when new evidence arrives. The headlines, on the other hand, often say, we have the answer. That is why the biggest mistakes often feel so dramatic. They are not just errors in a lab. They are errors that were turned into public certainty, and then the certainty broke. Now we can take a closer look at how a wrong idea gets built. It often begins with a real observation. Something seems to work. Something seems to correlate. Something seems to fit a theory. Then, because humans want a clean story, we build a chain. Observation becomes explanation. Explanation becomes policy. Policy becomes a rule. And soon, the rule becomes moral. If you do not follow it, people think you are reckless. This is how scientific mistakes become social mistakes. Nutrition is one of the clearest examples because it touches daily life. Imagine being a family in the 1970s or 1980s. You want to be healthy. You hear that fat is bad. You buy low-fat yogurt. You choose low-fat salad dressing. You switch to products labeled diet or light. Many of these products replace fat with sugar and refined starch. The calorie total stays high. The hunger signals do not improve, and some people gain weight. Later, the message shifts. Now sugar is blamed. Now carbohydrates are blamed. Now the public feels that science is a spinning wheel. But the deeper truth is that the original message was too simple. Diet is not one lever. It is a full environment. Another correction in nutrition is the story of trans fats. For years, partially hydrogenated oils were promoted as modern. They improved shelf life. They made baked goods easy to mass produce. They were sold as healthier than butter. Later, strong evidence showed that trans fats increase heart disease risk. Policies changed. Labeling changed. In many places, trans fats were restricted. This is a case where science corrected itself and policy followed, but the lag mattered. Millions consumed a harmful ingredient for decades. Now we can talk about another deeply important correction, and it involves how we judge evidence. Observational studies are common because they are easier to do. You track people. You ask what they eat. You look at outcomes. You find patterns. The problem is that people are not random. If one group eats more fish, they may also have more money. They may also have better health care. They may also exercise more. So the pattern may not be caused by fish. Randomized trials help, but they are expensive and difficult. Many of the biggest public nutrition claims were built on observational data. That made the field vulnerable. Now we move to a medical story that shows the same vulnerability. For decades, some doctors believed that controlling premature heartbeats after a heart attack would save lives. The logic sounded strong. Abnormal rhythms are dangerous, so suppressing them should help. Drugs were used to suppress these rhythms. Then a major trial showed that some of these drugs increased death. The treatment fixed the visible signal while making the deeper risk worse. This is a harsh lesson. A treatment can improve a marker without improving the outcome. A marker is not the same thing as a life. This lesson repeats across medicine. Lowering a lab number does not always mean reducing risk. Raising a lab number does not always mean improving health. Outcomes matter. Now we can move into another correction that became famous. For a long time, babies were sometimes placed to sleep on their stomachs. This was recommended in some places. It was thought to reduce choking. Later evidence supported the opposite for many infants. Back sleeping reduced the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. Public campaigns changed behavior. SIDS rates fell. This is a strong example of science updating practice with clear benefit. It also shows that even advice aimed at safety can be wrong. Now we can talk about another case where the timeline of correction was slow. X-rays were once used with far less caution. In the early and mid-20th century, X-rays were sometimes used for minor problems. People used them to fit shoes. Pregnant people were exposed without full awareness of fetal risk. Over time, evidence about radiation risk grew. Standards changed. This is another case where the mistake was not evil. It was a limited understanding of long-term risk. Now we move to a case that is often misunderstood as science being wrong, when it is really science learning scale. In infectious disease, early models of outbreaks can be wrong, not because the math is fake, but because the inputs are uncertain. How many people are infected? How fast it spreads? How much immunity exists? How behavior changes? Small changes in these inputs can change predictions. When a model shifts, the public thinks it failed. But models are tools for planning under uncertainty. This is why scientists often give ranges. The mistake happens when the range is ignored and the public hears a single number. Now we can go back to psychology for one of the most famous and debated findings. The marshmallow test became a symbol of self-control. The story was that children who can wait for a reward grow into more successful adults. There was some predictive value in early studies, but later work suggested that the result was strongly tied to environment. A child who grows up in unstable conditions may learn that promises are not reliable. In that world, taking the reward now is rational. This does not erase the value of self-control. It corrects a simple moral story. It shows that behavior can be shaped by trust and resources. Now we can talk about a famous neuroscience story that many people have heard: the left brain, right brain myth. People were told that left brain means logic and right brain means creativity. There are differences in hemispheres for certain tasks. Language often leans left, some spatial tasks lean right, but the popular split is an exaggeration. Most complex thinking uses networks across both sides. The mistake is turning a real detail into a personality system. Now we move to a story from medicine that shows how hard it is to change a field. In the 20th century, some doctors resisted the idea that doctors themselves could spread infection. This is older than 100 years, but the principle continued. Hospital infections remained a major problem. Hand hygiene compliance often stayed low. Even when evidence is strong, behavior change is hard. The correction is not just knowledge, it is systems, checklists, culture. Now we can talk about a case where science was too confident about a single mechanism. In brain disease research, there have been dominant theories that shaped funding for decades. When a single theory dominates, it can crowd out alternatives. If the theory is partly wrong, progress slows. The mistake is not having a theory. The mistake is locking the field into one story and treating dissent as noise. This is a structural problem. It is not solved by one experiment. Now we can talk about another case where a strong narrative outpaced the evidence. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a wave of claims about genes for complex traits: a gene for intelligence, a gene for depression, a gene for addiction. The reality is that many traits are polygenic. They involve many genes, each with small effect. Environment matters too. Early candidate gene studies often used small samples and produced false positives. Later, large genome-wide studies changed the picture. This is another lesson about scale. Some questions require huge data. Small studies can be misleading. Now we move to technology and engineering. In the 20th century, some new materials were celebrated as miracles. Asbestos is one example. It was fire-resistant, it was cheap, it was used widely in buildings and products. Later, evidence showed it causes lung disease and cancer. Regulation changed, but exposures remained. This is a case where the mistake was treating a useful property as if it had no cost. Now consider another material. Certain industrial chemicals were used for decades before their persistence and toxicity were fully understood. Some of these chemicals accumulate in bodies and ecosystems. The correction is slow because the chemicals last. Science can discover the harm, but the harm does not vanish. Now we can talk about how scientific mistakes interact with law. For years, forensic science used certain techniques with more confidence than the data supported. Some methods, like bite mark analysis, were treated as precise. Later reviews found that error rates were high. Wrongful convictions happened. This is a case where science was used in court without proper validation. The correction requires humility and strict testing. Now we can return to the early question. Should these mistakes make you trust science less? They should make you trust one thing more: the process of correction. A field that can admit error and update is healthier than a field that cannot. But you should also learn to recognize weak claims. Be cautious when you see a study with a tiny sample, a claim that sounds like a perfect story, a result that depends on one lab, a treatment that changes a marker but not outcomes, a headline that gives certainty without showing the limits. Now, to make this more concrete, we can walk through a short list of common traps that create the biggest scientific mistakes. The first trap is confusing correlation with cause. If two things move together, it does not mean one causes the other. The second trap is relying on self-report. People do not remember perfectly. People present themselves in a better light. People forget details. The third trap is multiple comparisons. If you test many outcomes, you will find something that looks significant by chance. The fourth trap is selective reporting. If only positive results get published, the literature becomes biased. The fifth trap is measuring the wrong thing. If you measure calmness in a lobotomy patient, you can miss the loss of life quality. If you measure cholesterol numbers, you can miss overall risk. If you measure test scores, you can miss creativity, resilience, and context. The sixth trap is incentives. A result that brings money will be pushed. A result that brings status will be repeated. A result that threatens an industry will be attacked. The seventh trap is the human love of stories. We want heroes. We want villains. We want simple lessons. Reality is often a pile of trade-offs. Now we can end where we began. Science in the last 100 years has been a machine for discovery. It has also been a machine for correction. It gets things wrong. Then it builds tools to see the error. Better statistics, better instruments, better trials, better ethics, better transparency. The public often experiences the wrong stage first because the wrong stage is loud. The correction stage is slower and less dramatic, but it is the part that matters. If you want to be informed without becoming cynical, the best posture is simple. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. Do not treat one study as a final answer, and do not treat scientific mistakes as proof that learning is impossible. They are proof that learning is hard, and that is why the method matters. There is one more correction worth ending on, because it sits behind many of the examples in this episode. It is the correction of how scientists talk about uncertainty. In earlier eras, many papers and textbooks used confident language even when data was thin. Part of that was culture. Part of it was the need to sound authoritative. Part of it was the lack of tools for handling uncertainty. Today, better fields try to speak in probabilities. They give confidence intervals. They explain limits. They separate what is known from what is guessed. This is not always done well, but it is an improvement. If you look across the last 100 years, you can see a steady trend. Early science often tried to sound like a final judge. Modern science, at its best, tries to sound like a careful investigator. That is one reason why modern papers can seem frustrating. They add caveats. They add limitations. They say more research is needed. People sometimes interpret that as weakness, but in many cases, it is honesty. There is also a correction in how science is built as a public institution. For a long time, many researchers kept data private. They kept methods vague. They treated criticism as an attack. Today, there is more pressure to share code, share data, and let others test claims. That pressure exists because of hard lessons, false positives, fraud cases, non-replication, overhyped medicine. When you hear about a replication crisis, it can sound like science is collapsing. Another way to see it is this. Science is building an immune system. It is learning how to detect its own errors. It is learning how to reduce noise. It is learning how to punish bad incentives. It is not perfect, but it is moving. And this matters because there is a second mistake people can make. The first mistake is blind trust. The second mistake is blind rejection. Blind trust says every study is truth. Blind rejection says every study is propaganda. Both are wrong. A better stance is to treat science like weather. A forecast can be useful even when it is not certain. A forecast can be updated. A forecast can be wrong. But it is still better than guessing based on vibes. Now, if we take the biggest mistakes we covered and boil them down, the shared themes are clear. When evidence is weak, be cautious. When a story is simple, ask what is missing. When incentives are strong, expect bias. When a claim is dramatic, demand replication. When a policy is built on a marker, ask about outcomes. And when an idea becomes a social rule, remember that rules can outlive the evidence. Science got many things wrong in the last 100 years. It also learned a lot about how to be less wrong, and that is the part that should stay with you. We can also add a final reminder about the way the public learns science. Most people do not read papers. They read headlines. They hear a clip. They see a chart on social media. This means the main battle is not only in labs, it is in translation. A careful result can become a careless message. A narrow finding can become a general rule. A tentative link can become a cause. Then, when the careful result is corrected, the careless message is still alive. You can see this in the way people talk about diet. You can see it in the way people talk about mental health. You can see it in the way people talk about medicine. If you want to avoid being whiplashed, it helps to do a few simple things. Look for whether the claim is based on one study or many. Look for whether the result was tested in randomized trials. Look for the sample size. Look for conflicts of interest. Look for the size of the effect. And look for whether the claim has been stable for years. A new claim is not always wrong, but the newest claim is often the least tested claim. Now, In a story like this, it is easy to leave with one false idea. That false idea is that scientists were foolish in the past and we are wise now. That is not true. Our era has its own blind spots. Some of them will be obvious in 20 years. Some will take longer. The best we can do is build systems that find errors faster. That means better data sharing. It means better replication. It means better training in statistics. It means better incentives. It means making it normal to publish negative results. It also means respecting the difference between debate and denial. Debate is how science improves. Denial is refusing to update in either direction. If you watch any field long enough, you will see that good scientists change their minds. They do not do it because they are weak. They do it because the world forced them to. That is the central discipline. Let the evidence push back, and when it does, update. Science got many things wrong in the last 100 years, but the deeper story is that science learned how to notice its own mistakes, and that learning is still in progress. One last point about what counts as wrong. Sometimes science is wrong because the claim is false. Cold fusion is a clear example. Faster than light neutrinos were a clear example. The 10% brain myth is a clear example. But sometimes science is wrong because it is too early. A field sees part of the picture and thinks it is the whole picture. It is not lying. It is just incomplete. That incompleteness can still do harm if people act as if it is final. This is why the best attitude is to hold ideas with the right grip. Grip them tightly when the evidence is strong. Grip them lightly when the evidence is new. And if the evidence is mixed, be honest that it is mixed. That is not indecision, it is accuracy. When you hear a confident claim, you can ask a simple question. What would change your mind? Good science has an answer to that. Bad science does not. And good public science, the science that reaches daily life, should teach people that question too. If you remember only one theme from this episode, make it this. A scientific claim is not a badge you wear. It is a tool you use. Tools are judged by performance. If a tool fails, you replace it. That does not mean you hate tools. It means you want better tools. The errors of the last 100 years are not a reason to stop asking questions. They are a reason to ask them with better methods. They are also a reminder that the loudest stage of science is not always the most accurate stage. The first discovery is loud. The first headline is loud. The first argument is loud. The careful follow-up is quieter. The replication is quieter. The correction is quieter. But the quiet part is where the truth gets built. And if you want a practical rule for daily life, here is one that works. When a claim tells you to overhaul your life based on a new study, pause. When a claim tells you that one food, one habit, or one supplement is the key, pause. When a claim tells you that every expert is lying except one brave outsider, pause. Strong evidence usually builds slowly. It shows up in many places. It survives criticism. It does not need a dramatic villain. In the long run, the most reliable ideas are often the least exciting ones. They are the ones that keep working when the hype is gone. So when you hear that science was wrong, do not ask only who was wrong. Ask what system allowed the mistake to spread. Ask what incentives rewarded the mistake. And ask what evidence finally corrected it. That is how you learn the real lesson. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,